The sacred seals are catalysts to help cast your incantations, and most of these are going to scale off the faith stat, so when going into faith is going to help you get a lot more damage out of your spells. Now there is one common misconception that a lot of people tend to get wrong that I do want to touch on, and that is that spells don't really scale off a particular stat, and instead they're actually going to scale off your seal and whatever the incant scaling is. And basically, if you don't know, the incant scaling is like your damage number of the seal itself. That just helps determine how much damage you're going to be getting out of your spells. So for instance, something like a Dragon Claw can scale with any single stat, it just depends on the seal. Something like the CLAWMARK seal, it can scale with Strength or Faith. The Dragon Communion seal, it can scale with Arcane Faith. Or you could just have on the ERDTREE seal and it's just going to purely scale off Faith. It does not matter what the requirements are of the spells, this is always going to be the case, except for when it comes to a couple of different types of spells, and that's one is going to be weapon buffs, and 2 healing spells. Now, no, it does not extend to body buffs, aura buffs, or health regen spells. These are always going to be a flat amount no matter what. And as long as you actually meet the requirements of these spells, you can just freely use them. You don't even need to meet the requirements of the seal, or even have the seal leveled up to just gain the maximum effect of these. But as for things like Electrify Armament, Order's Blade, Blood Flame Blade, Black Flame Blade, the damage portion of these buffs are just going to scale off Faith and your Faith scaling, and this also does extend to healing spells like ERDTREE Heal. So in these instances, incant scaling does not matter. So you're always better off pairing these types of spells with a spell with a really good Faith scaling. So say you had about 40 Faith and 80 Strength and was using the CLAWMARK seal and the ERDTREE seal, you're going to actually benefit more off the ERDTREE seal when using these particular types of spells, despite the CLAWMARK seal actually getting higher incant scaling. So if you ever really wonder why your healing spells aren't doing as much, this is probably going to be the reason. Now, there are 12 different seals in total, and almost every single one does have their own specific uses, and that's purely because that most of them actually do have their own passive effects to where they boost a particular spell school. And the good thing about this passive buff is that you don't necessarily have to use the seal just to benefit off it. As long as you have it equipped, just sitting in your offhand, you're always going to gain that buff. And yes, if you do have 2 of them, the passive effects can stack. So for instance, if you wanted to use lightning spells, you're always just best off just using the highest damaging seal that you can equip, and just putting the Gravelstone seal in your offhand. But when you want to go into New Game Plus, then you can go ahead and equip 2 of them. Now, before we do get started, please keep in mind this is just going to be for PvE. And as always, focus more on what I'm actually saying about these seals, more so than actually how I rank them or what tier that I put them in, because that's what's going to be most important. Now, at the bottom, we have the SPIRALTREE seal, which is one of the ones from the DLC. This one actually being acquired at the end of the DLC, and it also is just one of the worst ones based on damage. Compared to every other faith-based seal at any single level, it's just going to get some of the worst incant scaling. So there's practically no reason to use it as a primary option unless you're going to use this spiral incantations, because this seal does boost them by 20%, which is very nice. Now, the problem being is that the spiral incantations are not really that good. I kind of value Giant Golden Arc as a nice AoE spell, but for the most part, the other incantations are just going to be outclassed by the Golden Rings of Light ones, as those are also wholly damage based, but they're just going to be way better as a projectile option. So this is a very niche seal that is just borderline useless. Number 11, the Frenzied Flame Seal, which this one actually does seem like it's a pretty decent seal. It doesn't weigh anything, it has no requirements, gives you a 20% boost to your Frenzied Flame incantations, which for most of them are actually pretty good. And it actually gives you scalings in 4 different stats, one of them being Dexterity, so this is actually the only seal that actually can scale off that stat. Now the thing is, the damage just sucks. This skill actually does scale twice as good with Faith compared to every other stat, and with a pure Faith build, it just gets way worse damage than everything else. Even at 80 Faith with an ERDTREE seal, you actually can get more damage out of the Frenzied Flame incantations with this, even if you do account for that 20% boost. So for the most part, the only use that it does have is as an offhand option. Now, as I mentioned, it does get scalings in 4 different stats, the other ones being Strength, Dexterity, and Intelligence, which actually does scale equally off those 3 stats. Now, for the seals, you already get a really good Faith Intelligence seal and a good Strength Faith seal, and with those particular builds, those ones are just going to perform better. But with a Dexterity build, this is going to be the best seal to use, but the thing is, the damage is just awful. Between the levels of 10 and 80 Dexterity, it only actually gives you a 50 incant scaling boost, and it's to the point that even an 80 Dexterity and 20 Faith Frenzied Flame seal can actually be outdamaged by a 35 Faith Finger seal. Even at 80 Dexterity and 80 Strength, it actually gets outdamaged by the ERDTREE seal, and that seal doesn't even scale off Dexterity. Even at maximum level, at 99 and everything, it actually still gets outdamaged by stuff like the Golden Order seal and the Dragon Communion seal. But its only other use is just to serve as an offhand option to boost your Frenzied Flame incantations. And the fact that it is a weightless seal with no requirements doesn't really mean much either, being that a lot of the seals in the game have pretty low requirements and also don't really weigh much. Something like the Dragon Communion seal also doesn't weigh anything and only gets a 10 requirements in both Faith and Arcane. And you can get this seal right at the beginning of the game, where for this one, it's one of the most annoying seals to grab. Number 10, the Fire Knight's seal, which is another one from the DLC. This one scaling primarily off the Faith stat. And compared to all the other faith-based seals, this one just doesn't really get as much damage as some of them. Unless you are at higher levels where it can get some of the highest, it's still not going to get as much as the ERDTREE seal or the GODSLAYER seal. But it still is respectable damage, and if you are going to use the Mesmer Fire incantations, this is probably going to be the best seal to use, as it does boost the damage by 15%. Now, as I mentioned, you can just gain these like passive effects by just having the seal in your offhand, but if you actually just wanted to have the convenience of just having one seal equipped and one weapon equipped, you could just use this. Now, the reason why it's still going to get a bit lower despite it having a pretty decent use is that I think the Giant seal just outclasses this, as I do believe that the Giant's flame incantations are just typically better than the Mesmer Fire incantations, and this seal can be acquired earlier in the game and actually boost the Giant's flame incantations by 20% compared to the Fire Knight's 15%. So if I am going to try and go with an optimal build using fire spells, I'd rather go with the Giant's flame incantations, but these spells are still pretty fun to use as well. Number 9, the Giant seal, which this seal actually does scale primarily off faith as well, and actually does get some pretty poor damage across all the different stats. Like even the Finger Seal can just outdamage this no matter what. But the reason why it's still going to get into the B tier is because it does boost the Giant's flame incantations by 20%, which, as I just mentioned with the Fire Knight seal, if you're primarily going to use fire-based spells, because 20% is like the highest damage boost that you can get with the incantations, and the Giant's flame incantations, for the most part, are pretty good. But that's probably going to be its only use, just having it as an offhand option to just boost those incantations if you were going to use them, because otherwise as a primary option, I would just rather use things like the ERDTREE seal. Number 8, the DRYLEAF seal, which is another one from the DLC and another primarily faith-based seal, and this one actually can get some of the highest damage at certain types levels. Between 27 and 50 faith, this is the highest damaging faith-based seal. And once you get past those points, then the GODSLAYER seal and ERDTREE seal tend to be a bit better. But a lot of people at these medium levels, this might be the best seal to use, but the thing is, I'm still not going to value it much because it's all the way in the DLC, and by the time that you get to the DLC, you're probably going to be well over level 100, and you're probably going to have about 60 faith, or have some type of a hybrid build where another different seal is going to be better anyway. So you're never going to really actually benefit off the good scaling that it gets at earlier levels. Because yeah, this thing just falls off dramatically to the point where even at 80 faith, it's going to get outdamaged by almost every other faith seal. It would have been pretty useful if you could access the DLC earlier on in the game, because to get this seal, you don't have to kill any single boss in the DLC, you can just go run and pick it up. But you still have to kill bosses like Radahn and Moog just to get there. And I don't think you really benefit that much to go through all that effort just to go get the DRYLEAF seal that's going to eventually just be outclassed. Now, the reason why it's still going to get this high despite me thinking that it's useless as a primary option is because it does boost the Golden Rings of Light incantations by 15%, which these are like the best holy incantations in the entire game. And if you do have a faith-based build using like a lightning or a fire-based weapon, you obviously want to have some holy spells for coverage, especially when going through the DLC where a lot of enemies tend to be weaker to this. Now, the thing is, for most of these spells, they also do get boosted by the Golden Order seal, but the Golden Order seal only boosts them by 10%. But the funny thing is, you now have 2 different seals to actually boost a particular set of spells. That means you don't have to actually go into New Game Plus just to really benefit. So the uses that it does have are pretty good, but unfortunately it's not enough for me to put it higher than a B tier. Number 7, the Finger Seal. Now, this is the best seal to have earlier in the game because you do get it right at the beginning of the game. All of the starting classes that actually do give you incantations come alongside the Finger Seal. And it's just like the best one to use at these earlier levels. Until you meet the requirements for the other different types of seals, then you're better off switching to those. So once you get 27 faith, you're best switching to the GODSLAYER seal, because that's just going to give you more damage and actually give you a passive effect. Because yeah, unfortunately, the Finger Seal doesn't actually boost any different types of incantations. So outside of that, it's practically useless, but it still is going to get a high B tier because you get it right at the beginning of the game. And for almost every single build, I always just recommend going into about 15 faith, just to be able to use a bunch of these really cheap incantations. Things like Flame Gummy Strength or the Fortification spells, Bestial Vitality. These are very handy to have, and you can just slap on the Finger Seal, as it has very low requirements and doesn't weigh very much. So that could be pretty decent, but I think things like the Dragon Communion Seal or the Frenzied Flame Seal could be better for this use, as those don't actually weigh anything. Number 6, the Gravel Stone Seal, which is yet again another primarily faith-based seal. I do not know why this one wasn't a dexterity faith seal. It would have made perfect sense, and it would have given us a dexterity option for the seals, and it would have made that build type a lot better. But yeah, unfortunately, we're just stuck with a bunch of these mediocre faith seals. Because yes, this is another seal that's just going to be outdamaged by a lot of other seals like the Golden Order seal and the ERDTREE seal. But the reasons why it's still going to get this high is because it does boost your Dragon Cult incantations by 15%, which is part of the reason why I did mention that it should be scaling off the dexterity stat, because lightning in this game does scale off dexterity too. But the Dragon Cult incantations are just amazing. It houses some of the most broken options like Ancient Dragon's Lightning Strike and Knight's Lightning Spear. These are like easily like top 3 incantations that can just destroy the entire game very easily. So you very well can just use the Gravel Stone Seal as your primary option. And even at 80 faith, if you're using lightning spells, you're going to get more damage out of the Gravel Stone Seal than you are going to get with the Erdtree Seal. But once again, just having it in the offhand and having the Erdtree Seal in the main hand is going to do better until you go to New Game Plus to where you can actually get 2 Gravel Stone Seals. Now you might be wondering, if it's really only useful as like an offhand option, why is it going to get into the A tier? And that is because lightning spells are probably the most important spell type that you actually can get with the incantations, because typically if you have a faith-based build, you're probably going to have a holy or a fire-based weapon, because most of the faith weapons in the game fall under these 2 damage types. And when you're making builds, you always want to have coverage and damage types. And lightning is going to be one that you want to have because it is the best elemental damage type in the game, as a lot of enemies are weaker to it, and any single time that it's raining or where there's water around, you're just doing bonus damage. And now with the DLC, we have things like the Priestess Hearts to actually further boost the damage of these incantations by an additional 20%. These types of builds can just be utterly broken. So any single time that you do have a faith build, I just recommend going with the Gravel Stone Seal, because more likely than not, you're going to be fighting bosses to where you actually want to use those lightning types of spells. And as putting this in your main hand or your offhand is going to serve you a great benefit. Number 5, the CLAWMARK seal, which is definitely one of the coolest seals in the entire game, as it does allow you to actually get respectable incan scaling with just a pure strength type of build. Which this is just like unheard of in the Soul series, like just being able to go all into strength and actually gain respectable spell damage. It does actually scale equally off strength and faith. If you wanted to use this with a faith-based build, this is not going to be the option at all. And once you get to higher levels with a strength faith-based build, it's not going to be that good either. Like even at 80 strength and 80 faith, it's just going to get outdamaged by the Erdtree seal no matter what. So it only would pair it with like a pure strength type of build that has like a little bit of faith to meet the requirements for some spells. And the fact that it actually does count as a strength-based weapon, when you do two-handed, you actually do gain that 50% strength bonus. So you have 54 strength with your build, you can go ahead and two-hand the CLAWMARK seal, and it would essentially be like having 80 strength. And an 80 strength CLAWMARK seal is actually almost just as much damage as like a 40 or 50 faith finger seal or a GODSLAYER'S seal, which is actually pretty decent. And there are so many really good strength faith-based weapons in this game that could pair perfectly alongside this seal, and you can make for very broken builds. And on top of all this, it actually does boost your bestial incantations by 10%, which 10% is really not that much, and I don't really care much for the bestial incantations anyway, but it's still going to get into the A tier purely because that it is just amazing to have with a pure strength build. Number 4, the GODSLAYER'S seal, which this is one of the best faith-based seals in the entire game. In fact, if you're actually between the levels of 27 and 69 faith, this is the best seal to use, unless you do include the DRYLEAF seal, but you get that one way later in the game where you're probably going to be at a higher level anyway. And at these higher levels, the GODSLAYER'S seal can just do better. So yeah, for a good chunk of the game, this is just going to be the seal to use. And luckily enough, you actually do get it in Stormveil Castle, so you can get it pretty early on. Once you get to 27 faith, just go upgrade this thing, and it's going to help carry you throughout the entire playthrough. And you could very well just leave this one on as your primary option if you didn't want to have to like switch the Erdtree seal and level up your Somber Stones, and you wanted to save those stones for another weapon. This is not going to get that much less damage than the Erdtree seal, and the GODSLAYER'S seal actually does boost your Black Flame incantations by 15%, which are also pretty good. Things like Black Flame and Scouring Black Flame are just solid fire-based options, and doing that percentage damage over time is always going to be good, especially against bosses with larger amounts of health. So yeah, that's basically the reason why it gets into the S tier, is because throughout most of the game, this is just going to be the seal to use. Number 3, the Golden Order seal, which actually is one of the highest damaging seals in the entire game. In fact, at lower levels and like at really high levels, at max specifically, it actually can outdamage all of the other seals. Because yes, this is a faith and intelligence based seal, does get an A scaling in both, and at 25 intelligence faith, it actually can outdamage all the other seals at 40 faith, and even at 35 faith and intelligence, it outdamages all the other faith based seals at 60 faith. And yes, if you wanted to know, the math does check out. 35 faith and intelligence is just as much stat investment as just going into 60 faith. But the thing is, once you do get past this point, the Erdtree seal is just going to outdamage it at these same levels. And it isn't until you get to like really high levels, like 70 faith and intelligence, that you start to notice that the Golden Order seal starts to do a bit more damage. And the thing is, most of the game is probably going to be played at the levels that the Erdtree seal is going to be best in. So I wouldn't necessarily call it the most useful seal, but there is going to be the benefit of just having to spec into intelligence, because you gain access to sorceries as well. You can actually help meet the requirements for a lot of different types of magic spells, some frost-based spells. You can just throw in a staff, and it can actually help with a variety variety of your build a whole ton. Now the thing is, Faith and Intelligence builds do come with some downsides. One, if you are at earlier levels, it's going to be a bit of a problem to try and meet the requirements for like these really expensive spells. And the most annoying thing about Faith and Intelligence builds is that there's like no weapon options. You basically only have one in the Sword of Night and Flame, which thankfully is actually one of the best weapons in the game, but you don't really have anything else past that point. There's hardly any other weapons that can do this, and there's no infusion either for Faith and Intelligence. So you definitely are limited in build creation when it comes to using this seal, but it doesn't change the fact that it can be one of the highest damaging ones, especially if you do pair it alongside the Golden Order incantations, as it can boost those by 10%, but as I mentioned earlier, the DRYLEAF seal actually can boost them by 15%, so that one's probably going to serve better as an offhand option, but this seal is going to be the better primary one. Number 2, the ERDTREE seal. This is just the best seal to have at higher levels. Once you do get to 69 nice Faith and above, you're just going to be using this one. And it's not until you get to like level 300 or 400 where you actually gain lots of points in multiple different stats that you probably want to switch to something like the Golden Order seal or the Dragon Communion seal. So for a good chunk of the game, the ERDTREE seal is going to be best. And honestly, even at lower levels, I would probably recommend going with this one too. Or at least for when you actually meet the minimum requirements of 40 Faith for this seal. And that's because it does require Somber Stones. For like most of the seals in the game and all the other Faith-based seals, they're just going to require Smithing Stones, which is a much harder upgrade path, as the Smithing Stones are a pain in the ass to get sometimes, especially if you are trying to level up multiple different Smithing Stone weapons. And by the time that you do get the ERDTREE seal, you can very well have a +9 Summer weapon, and a +9 ERDTREE seal is going to perform much better than like a +16 GODSLAYER'S seal. Doesn't matter what level that you're at between that 40 and 69 Faith, the ERDTREE seal is going to outdamage it. And even after you killed Morgoth and gained access to the Bell Bearing and the Mountaintops, it's probably still going to be better than having like a +20 or +21 GODSLAYER seal, because the ERDTREE seal is probably going to be the one that you finish on anyway, so you might as well just go level this one up instead of having to level up multiple different seals that you're going to just end up switching anyway. But if you did want to save your Somber Stones for something, then I would just go with the GODSLAYER seal. But yes, with a Faith-based build, the ERDTREE seal is the one to use, and especially if you are going to be using healing spells or weapon buffs, the ERDTREE seal is the one that you're going to use no matter what of incant scaling. But the only other downside that I can say about the ERDTREE seal is that it doesn't actually boost any different types of incantations, which I don't know why this thing didn't get like a 10% damage boost or a 15% damage boost to your ERDTREE spells. That would have been really cool, but it still is deserving of an S tier. And it's number 1, the Dragon Communion seal, which is like one of the most broken things in the entire game. Like the fact that you can get respectable damage out of your incantations with an arcane build is just ridiculous enough as it is. But the thing is, you can actually get more damage out of your incantations with an arcane build with this seal, more so than you can with a Faith build. And with an arcane build, you're going to have access to arcane based weapons, like all the most broken bleed weapons in the entire game can be paired perfectly alongside this thing. And the funny thing is, you get it right at the beginning of the game. It doesn't weigh anything. It only has a 10 Faith and 10 Arcane requirement. And it also requires Somber Stones. So basically from start to finish, you can very well just get more damage out of this seal, more so than any other Faith-based seal. Now the downside is that you're obviously going to have to spec into a lot of arcane. So if you actually want to meet the requirements for certain types of like expensive spells, it's probably not going to have good synergy with this seal. But what this seal actually does have good synergy with is the Dragon Communion spells, which the Dragon Communion spells are like the most broken things on the entire planet, as all of the breath spells just do like amazing damage, go incredibly far, can proc statuses quickly, it gives you access to almost every single damage type, and then you have other spells like Dragon Maw, Dragon Claw, that are just amazing spells that do insane damage, really good stance damage. And now as of the DLC, you have the Rock Heart's Talisman, which just like the Dragon Communion seal, boosts the damage by 20%. And with all these things combined, plus with the Blue Dancer's Charm, you're just making for some of the most broken builds in the entire game, as you get access to basically every single damage type, every single status effect, and just get monstrous amounts of stance damage, while being good at close range, further ranges. Like, it's just broken. Like, Faith Arcane builds are probably the best build type in the entire game, and it is purely because of the Dragon Communion seal. Okay, that's now done, and as promised, here is a chart of all the incant scalings across every single soft cap. I know people would have liked to have all this information in one neat little chart, so I just thought to include it here at the end. This doesn't necessarily mean that the highest damaging ones are the best options, as I would have went over in the video, but if you did want this information, here it is, do with it what you will. The next video, I'm probably going to go ahead and rank the crossbows and the ballistas, because I actually forgot about doing that video, but definitely after the crossbow ballista video, I'm going to rank their staves, so definitely do subscribe for that one if you haven't already. And also do follow me on Twitch, because I actually am currently in the middle of a Souls marathon, just going back and playing all the older games, because actually is my 10-year anniversary since playing my first Souls game, so definitely do pop by. Anyway, catch you guys around. See ya!